My son's girlfriend's dad knocked on my door at 1 a.m. and said, "Your son beat my daughter unconscious tonight." I stared behind him to see her sitting in the passenger seat of their car. Split lip, bloody nose, badly bruised cheek, holding an ice pack over one eye. I looked back at her dad, who looked ready to kill. "That's not possible," I stammered out. "He loves—" "She told me everything," he cut me off. "Police are coming in the morning." He slammed the door and walked away. I immediately ran upstairs to check on Ryder. He was asleep, but I turned on the light anyway. He woke up confused. That's when I saw the fresh scratches on his neck and forearm. "What happened with Sienna tonight?" I asked. He shot up instantly, rubbing his eyes. Nothing. We had a fight. I dropped her home. That's it." "What kind of fight?" I pressed him. He started stammering. "She was accusing me of stuff. I don't want to talk about it right now." His voice was defensive. I noticed his knuckles, red and bruised. The police showed up at 9 a.m. the next morning. A detective knocked on the door with 2 officers behind him. "We have a warrant for Ryder's arrest." Ryder came downstairs in his pajamas. He saw the police and went pale. "Dad, what's happening?" The detective read him his rights. "The victim identified you. Neighbors heard screaming from your car around 7 last night." "Dad, I swear I didn't—" Ryder was panicking. The officer cuffed his hands behind his back. I watched them walk my son to the police car. I stood in my doorway thinking about the scratches, the bruises on his knuckles, the fight he wouldn't elaborate on. I visited Ryder in jail that afternoon. He was sitting on a metal bench looking terrified. "Dad, you have to believe me. I didn't hit her." "Then explain why she looks beat up. Explain the scratches and bruises on your knuckles." He leaned forward. "We fought in the car. She was yelling. I was yelling back. She hit me and I grabbed her wrist to stop her. That's where the scratches came from. I swear I dropped her home at 7:30 and left." I wanted to believe him, but Sienna's dad was already filing charges. He hired a lawyer. I talked to our lawyer the next day. She told me Sienna's testimony was bad. Sienna said Ryder drove her somewhere isolated, beat her within an inch of her life, then dumped her near her house around 10 at night. The neighbor already confirmed hearing them argue at 7. "What about the bruises on his knuckles?" I asked. The lawyer looked at her notes. "Ryder claims he punched his steering wheel after dropping her off because he was so angry. Everything he said sounded like an excuse." I went back to see Ryder. He was desperate now. "Dad, I'll take a lie detector test. Please, check my phone, my car. I didn't do it." "Then why is she saying this?" Ryder broke down. "I don't know. Maybe she's scared and confused. Maybe someone's threatening—" "I'll believe you," I cut him off. "But if you're lying to me—" "Dad, I love her," he interrupted. "I would never hit her. You know me." Ryder's behavior had changed now. He wasn't defensive anymore, rather genuinely desperate to prove his innocence. And as a father, I couldn't not trust my son. I decided to investigate myself. I drove to Sienna's neighborhood and knocked on doors. The neighbor 2 doors down, a sweet lady in her 80s, had a Ring camera. I asked her for the footage and she happily obliged. The camera showed Ryder's car dropping Sienna off at 7:35. I watched anxiously as Sienna got out of the car and walked away from her house. Ryder drove off in the opposite direction. Then at 9:45, a different car pulled up. Sienna got out of this car stumbling. She was heavily bruised and beaten now, falling to the ground and crawling to her door. I zoomed in on the footage but couldn't make anything out. Was this someone else, or had Ryder used someone else's car to make himself look innocent? I brought the footage to the police station either way. The detective watched the footage twice and called Sienna and her father in for a second interview. I sat behind the glass watching. The detective showed Sienna the footage. "We have video of you arriving home at 9:45 from a different vehicle. You looked injured in this footage. Who drove you home at 9:45? Sienna started shaking. She wouldn't answer. All of a sudden, she lunged into her dad's arms and started sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Her dad put his arm around her. "Sienna, it's okay, baby. Daddy's got you." He embraced her for a minute and everyone stopped asking questions, giving her the minute she very clearly needed. Finally, she pulled away and her dad wiped her tears with a tissue. "Sienna, who did this to you? Who did it, baby?" She looked around and finally she said it. "Someone named Dante." My stomach dropped. Dante was my other son. He was 22. He had serious anger issues and had just left for a work trip a few days ago. "I've been seeing Dante for 2 months. Behind Ryder's back," Sienna cried. "That night after Ryder dropped me off, I went to meet Dante. We got into an argument and he beat me. Then he threatened me. He said if I told anyone it was him, he'd come back and finish it. He said blame Ryder or he'd make it worse. I was so scared." Sienna's dad went pale. "My God, I almost destroyed an innocent kid." The detective looked at me. "Where is Dante now?" I fumbled for my phone with shaking hands. "He's supposed to be on a work trip, but I don't know exactly where." My voice came out weak and unsteady. The detective reached across the table and put his hand over my phone. "Don't call him yet. We need to coordinate this carefully or he might run." I pulled my hand back and stared at him. My brain was trying to catch up with what was happening. My son Dante beat Sienna. My son Dante threatened her. My son Dante let his brother go to jail for something he did. The detective pulled out a notepad and clicked his pen. I need Dante's phone number, his employer information, and details about his vehicle. Another officer walked into the room and stood by the door with his radio. I scrolled through my contacts and read off Dante's number. The officer by the door immediately started making calls into his radio. He works for Westbrook Construction, I think. Or he did last time I checked. I was struggling to remember basic facts about my own son. He drives a black Ford truck. 2015, maybe. The detective wrote everything down while I sat there feeling like the worst father in the world. My mind kept racing backward through memories. Dante punching a hole in his bedroom wall when he was 16. Dante's girlfriend in high school who stopped coming around suddenly and wouldn't talk to me about why. Dante getting fired from his first job and blaming everyone but himself. The warning signs were always there and I just ignored them. I thought he was just angry sometimes. I thought he would grow out of it. Through the glass, I could still see Sienna crying in her dad's arms. The detective stood up. "Stay here. I'll be back." He walked into the interview room and I watched him sit down across from Sienna. Her dad was still holding her, but she had stopped sobbing so hard. The detective's voice came through a speaker in the observation room. "Sienna, I know this is difficult. Can you give us a full statement about what Dante did to you tonight?" She nodded slowly and wiped her face with the tissue. Her voice was so quiet I had to lean closer to the glass to hear. After Ryder dropped me off, I walked down the street to where Dante was waiting. He picked me up in his truck. She paused and took a shaky breath. We started driving and I told him I felt bad about lying to Ryder. That's when he got mad. Her father squeezed her shoulder. He started yelling that I belonged to him, that Ryder didn't deserve me. I tried to get out at a red light, but he grabbed my arm and wouldn't let go. I watched her touch the bruises on her face. He drove to this empty parking lot behind a closed store. He kept screaming at me. Then he hit me. Her voice broke. He hit me so many times. He said if I told anyone it was him, he would come back and finish it. He said blame Ryder or it would be worse next time. I had to look away from the glass. That was my son she was describing. My son who did that to this girl. A woman in a police uniform walked past the observation room, and I heard her talking about release paperwork. The jail supervisor. She was here to start processing Ryder's release. I stood up feeling torn in half. Part of me wanted to stay and help them find Dante. Part of me needed to get to Ryder right now. The detective came back into the observation room. "We're issuing a warrant for Dante's arrest. Officers are already tracking his phone." He looked at me with something like pity. "Go get your son and take him home. We'll call you as soon as we locate Dante." I nodded and left the police station. My hands were still shaking when I got in my car. The jail was only 10 minutes away, but it felt like the longest drive of my life. I kept rehearsing what I would say to Ryder. Sorry didn't feel like enough. Sorry didn't erase the jail cell. Sorry didn't undo the terror he must have felt. I pulled into the jail parking lot and walked inside. The woman at the front desk checked my ID and made me wait in a plastic chair. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Finally, a guard brought Ryder through a metal door. He looked so small. His eyes were empty and scared in a way I had never seen before. The orange jail uniform hung loose on his frame. We walked to the car in silence. I wanted to hug him, but something in his body language told me not to touch him. The drive home was quiet except for the sound of the engine. Ryder stared out the window at nothing. I tried to say something. "Ryder, I'm so sorry. I should have believed you from the start." He flinched away from me like I had tried to hit him. His jaw was clenched tight. We got home and Ryder walked straight upstairs to his room. I heard the lock click. I stood outside his door listening. After a few minutes, I heard him crying. Not loud sobbing, but quiet, broken sounds that were somehow worse. I put my hand on the door and felt destroyed. My son Dante did this. My son Dante put his brother through hell. My son Dante beat a girl and threatened her into lying. And I almost didn't believe Ryder when he swore he was innocent. I went downstairs and sat on the couch staring at my phone. 2 hours passed. The detective's number appeared on my screen, and I answered before the first ring finished. "We tracked Dante's phone to a motel 3 states away. Local police are moving in to arrest him now." My stomach dropped. This was real. My son was a fugitive who beat his brother's girlfriend and made her blame someone else. "I'll call you when we have him in custody." The detective hung up. I sat there feeling sick. 40 minutes later, my phone rang again. "Dante is in custody. No incident during the arrest. He'll be extradited back within 48 hours. The detective paused. When we first approached him, he claimed he didn't know what this was about. The moment we mentioned Sienna's name, he asked for a lawyer. I thanked him and ended the call. I walked back upstairs and knocked on Ryder's door. "Ryder, can we talk?" Nothing. I knocked again. "Ryder, please." Still nothing. I could hear him breathing on the other side of the door, but he wouldn't respond to my voice. I went back downstairs and called my sister, who works as a social worker. She answered on the 3rd ring. "I need help. Ryder was falsely accused and spent time in jail. He's not talking to me. He won't come out of his room." My sister was quiet for a moment. "There's a therapist named Gracie Shepard who specializes in trauma and false accusation cases. I'll text you her number." I thanked her and hung up. The house felt too quiet. Ryder was locked in his room. Dante was in a jail cell 3 states away. And I was sitting alone trying to figure out how everything fell apart so fast. That night, I laid in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep wouldn't come. My brain kept replaying everything. Dante had anger problems when he was younger, but I thought he got better. I remembered the holes he punched in our walls when he was 16, 3 different times. I made him patch them and figured it was just teenage stuff. His girlfriend back in high school stopped coming around suddenly. I asked him why, and he said she was crazy and blamed him for everything. I believed him. When things went wrong, Dante always had someone else to blame. His boss was unfair. His friends betrayed him. Girls led him on. I kept making excuses for him instead of seeing the pattern. I got up around 6 because there was no point pretending I could sleep. Made coffee and sat at the kitchen table feeling sick. Around 8, there was a knock on my door. I opened it and found Sienna's father standing on my porch. He looked awful. Dark circles under his eyes. His clothes wrinkled like he slept in them. We both just stood there for a minute. Finally, he spoke. I need to apologize. I almost destroyed your son. I was so sure Ryder did it. I shook my head. I'm sorry Dante hurt Sienna. I'm sorry I didn't see what he was becoming. We were 2 dads who completely failed. Him by not believing his daughter fast enough. Me by not seeing my son was dangerous. He rubbed his face with both hands. Sienna is terrified. She thinks Dante will get out somehow and come finish what he started. She barely sleeps. Won't leave the house. I felt my stomach drop. I promise I'll do everything I can to make sure he's held accountable. Saying it out loud felt like betraying Dante, but I meant it. Sienna's father nodded and walked away. I went back inside and called a lawyer my sister recommended, Finn Shepard. His office was downtown. I drove there that afternoon. Finn was maybe 40 with glasses and a calm way of talking that made me feel slightly less panicked. I explained everything. Ryder's false accusation, the arrest, the jail time, Dante being the real attacker. I need Ryder's record cleared, I told Finn. He wrote notes on a legal pad. That's going to be complicated. Ryder was formally charged and spent time in jail. Even though he's completely innocent now, the system doesn't just erase that automatically. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair. What do we need to do? Finn explained the process. Filing motions. Getting the charges officially dismissed. Applying for expungement. It could take months. He also told me something I hadn't thought about. Dante will probably try to contact you from jail. You need to decide right now what boundaries you're setting. I stared at him. What do you mean? Finn leaned forward. You're his father. But he did something terrible. He beat a girl. He framed his own brother. You need to figure out how to handle that before he calls. I drove home not knowing the answer. How do you be a dad to a son who hurt people like that? But I also couldn't just pretend Dante didn't exist. He was still my kid. The next day, Ryder finally came out of his room. It was afternoon. He looked exhausted. His hair was messy, and he had dark circles that matched his girlfriend's dad. He wouldn't look at me. Just shuffled toward the kitchen. Has Dante been arrested yet? His voice was flat, empty. Yeah, 2 days ago. Ryder nodded once and got a glass of water from the sink. He drank it standing there with his back to me. I tried to start a conversation. I found a therapist. Her name is Gracie Shepard. She works with people who went through what you did. Ryder turned around fast. I don't want to talk about my feelings with some stranger. It was the first real emotion I'd seen from him since he got out. Anger. His face was red and his jaw was tight. Part of me was almost relieved. At least anger was something. Better than the empty nothing he'd been showing. Okay, we don't have to do that yet. He went back to his room and locked the door again. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered it and heard an automated voice saying this was a call from the county jail. Then Dante's voice came on. He was crying. Dad? Dad, please, I need to talk to you. My chest got tight. I'm here. Dante sobbed into the phone. It was an accident. I swear, Sienna just made me so angry and I lost control for a minute. I didn't mean to hurt her that bad. I closed my eyes. Dante, did you beat Sienna and threaten her? Long silence. I could hear him breathing. Finally, he said yes, but his voice changed. Got defensive. You don't understand the whole story, though. Sienna was cheating on me with other guys. She was playing me. I was just trying to teach her a lesson about respect. My whole body went cold. Not my blood. My whole body. He was justifying it, making excuses, blaming her. A lesson? Dante, you put her in the hospital. He kept talking. She needed to learn. Girls think they can do whatever they want and guys will just take it. I was showing her actions have consequences. I felt sick. This was my son talking. Dante, stop. But he didn't stop. Are you going to help me get a lawyer? I need a good one. The public defender they gave me sucks. Dad, you have to help me. I took a breath. I'll make sure you have legal representation, but I can't help you avoid consequences for what you did. Dante's voice changed again. Got angry. So you're choosing Ryder over me? Your golden boy who never does anything wrong? I'm your son too. My hands started shaking. This isn't about choosing. You beat someone. You threatened her. You let your brother go to jail for it. Dante yelled into the phone. Ryder's fine. He was only in there a few days. Sienna is fine too. Everyone is being so dramatic about this. I couldn't listen anymore. I hung up. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. I sat there on the couch trying to breathe. That was my son. I raised him, and he had no idea what he did was wrong. The next morning, the prosecutor called while I was making coffee. She introduced herself and said they were charging Dante with assault and battery, witness intimidation, and making terroristic threats. Her voice was professional and direct. She explained that with Sienna's testimony and the video evidence from the neighbor's camera, they had a strong case against Dante. But then she said they needed Ryder to testify about the scratches on his neck and the false accusation. She needed him to explain how Dante's actions led to his arrest and time in jail. I told her I would talk to Ryder about it. My hands were shaking when I hung up. I walked upstairs and knocked on Ryder's door. He opened it looking tired. I told him the prosecutor wanted him to testify about what happened. His face went completely pale. He stepped back from the doorway. He said he couldn't face a courtroom after being the one accused. His voice was shaking. He said he couldn't sit in front of people and talk about being in jail when everyone thought he beat Sienna. I could see he was barely holding himself together. His hands were trembling and he kept looking at the floor. I didn't push it. I told him we didn't have to decide right now. But I knew the prosecutor would need his testimony to show the full scope of what Dante did. Without Ryder explaining the false accusation, the jury wouldn't understand how Dante destroyed his brother's life to cover his own crime. I left Ryder alone and called Finn to set up a meeting. 2 days later, I sat in Finn's office going over paperwork. The office was small with law books lining the walls and a desk covered in folders. Finn explained that getting Ryder's arrest record sealed and expunged would take months of paperwork and court filings. He said even after it was done, the experience would still be part of Ryder's reality forever. The trauma didn't just disappear because the charges were dropped. We also talked about filing a civil suit against Dante on Ryder's behalf for the emotional damage. Finn warned me that collecting any money would be difficult since Dante would be in prison and had no assets. But he said sometimes having a legal judgment mattered more than the money. It was about making the harm official and documented. I signed the papers authorizing Finn to start the process. He told me Dante had been extradited back, and his arraignment was set for the following week. I could attend if I wanted, but Finn advised me to stay away. He said my presence might be used by Dante's public defender to argue he had family support and wasn't a danger to the community. I didn't know what to do. Part of me needed to see Dante in person, but I also didn't want to help his case in any way. That night, I woke up to screaming. It took me a second to realize it was coming from Ryder's room. I ran down the hall and burst through his door. Ryder was tangled in his sheets, sweating and crying. His eyes were closed, but he was yelling about being trapped in a cell. He kept saying he didn't do it over and over. I rushed to his bed and grabbed his shoulders. He finally woke up, but when he looked at me, his eyes were empty. He stared at me like he didn't know who I was. It took almost a minute before recognition came back to his face. Then he started crying for real. I sat on the edge of his bed while he cried. He didn't want to talk about the nightmare. He just pulled his knees up to his chest and rocked back and forth. I stayed there until he fell back asleep. The nightmares became a regular thing after that. Every few nights I would hear him screaming. Sometimes I could wake him up quickly. Other times he stayed trapped in the dream for minutes that felt like hours. After a week of this, I brought up therapy again. I told Ryder about Gracie Shepherd and how she worked with people who went through trauma like his. He was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal. He didn't look up from his bowl. I said just one session, just to try it. He was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said okay, but his voice was flat. I made the appointment for the next day. When the time came, Ryder got in the car without arguing. The drive to Gracie's office took 20 minutes. He stared out the window the whole time. I dropped him off and told him I would wait in the parking lot. He was gone for 90 minutes. When he came out, he walked straight to the car and got in. He didn't say anything. At home, he went straight to his room and closed the door. I didn't hear from him the rest of the day. But later that night, my phone buzzed with a text from him. It just said he would go back next week. That was all. But it was something. The next afternoon, Sienna's father knocked on my door. We stood on the porch and he looked uncomfortable. He said Sienna wanted to apologize to Ryder in person for falsely accusing him. She felt terrible about what happened and thought it might help both of them to talk. But her therapist wasn't sure if that was a good idea yet. He wanted to know what I thought. I told him I needed to talk to Gracie about it first. Later that day, I called Gracie and explained the situation. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Ryder wasn't ready for that conversation. She said he was still processing the betrayal and trauma of being accused by someone he loved. Having Sienna apologize in person might seem like closure, but it could actually set him back. She said maybe in a few months, but not now. I called Sienna's father back and told him. He understood. He said Sienna was struggling with guilt about the whole thing. I felt bad for her too. She was a victim in all this, just like Ryder. But Gracie was right. Ryder needed time. The morning of Dante's arraignment, I got dressed in a suit. Finn had told me to stay away, but I couldn't. I needed to see Dante in person. I needed to look at my son and try to understand how this happened. The courthouse was downtown in a big gray building. I went through security and found the right courtroom. It was smaller than I expected with wooden benches and fluorescent lights. I sat in the back. Other people filtered in. Sienna's father arrived with Sienna. She looked smaller somehow. Her bruises had faded, but you could still see the shadow of them on her face. The prosecutor sat at one table shuffling papers. Then they brought Dante out. He was wearing an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. Two officers walked on either side of him. He looked around the courtroom and his eyes found mine. His expression changed to something desperate and pleading. He mouthed the words, "Dad, please." But I had to look away. I couldn't handle the guilt of seeing him like that. The judge came in and everyone stood. The arraignment started. Dante's public defender was a young woman with dark hair pulled back. She stood and entered a plea of not guilty on Dante's behalf. Then she argued for bail. She said Dante wasn't a flight risk despite leaving the state. She claimed he left for work reasons before he knew he was wanted. The prosecutor stood up and presented evidence that Dante fled immediately after the assault. She showed the timeline of the beating, the threat to Sienna, and his departure the next day. She also presented Sienna's testimony about the threat. She said Dante told Sienna he would come back and finish it if she told anyone. The judge listened to both sides. Then she denied bail. She said the evidence of witness intimidation and flight made Dante a danger to the community and a flight risk. After the arraignment ended, I stood to leave. Dante's public defender approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She introduced herself and asked if I was Dante's father. I said yes. She asked if I would be willing to testify as a character witness for Dante at trial. She said it would help the jury see him as a person with family support and not just a criminal. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I told her I couldn't do that. I said I loved my son, but I couldn't stand up in court and pretend what he did was out of character, because the truth was I was realizing it wasn't out of character at all. I was realizing I had missed signs for years. She looked disappointed but nodded. She said she understood. I walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon air. My chest felt tight. I had just refused to help my own son, but I also knew I had made the right choice. Dante needed to face real consequences for what he did, and I couldn't stand in the way of that just because he was my blood. Back at home that evening, I couldn't stop thinking about all the signs I'd missed with Dante over the years. I walked upstairs to his room and opened the door. The space felt different now, like I was seeing it for the first time. I started going through his desk drawers, his closet, under his bed. I wasn't sure what I was looking for exactly, but I needed to understand how I'd been so blind. In the bottom drawer of his nightstand, I found a leather journal. The cover was worn and the pages were filled with his handwriting. I sat on his bed and opened it. The first entry was dated 2 years ago. My hand started shaking as I read. Page after page of angry rants about women who rejected him. Girls from college who turned him down for dates. A coworker who wasn't interested. His ex-girlfriend Sarah who broke up with him. The entries about Sarah made my skin crawl. He wrote about teaching her respect. About making her understand she belonged to him. About how women needed to learn their place. There were detailed descriptions of arguments they'd had where he grabbed her arms hard enough to bruise. He wrote about following her after they broke up to see who she was dating. The last entry about Sarah said he'd shown up at her apartment at midnight and pounded on the door until her new boyfriend threatened to call the police. I felt sick reading it. This wasn't just anger issues. This was a pattern of control and violence going back years. I closed the journal and sat there for a long time. Then I called Finn and asked if I could bring something to his office in the morning. The next day, I drove to Finn's office with the journal in a folder on my passenger seat. His secretary let me in, and I sat across from his desk. I slid the journal across to him without saying anything. He opened it and started reading. His expression got more serious with each page. After about 10 minutes, he looked up at me. He said this could be relevant evidence showing a pattern of behavior. But he also said using it meant betraying Dante's privacy. It could make his case significantly worse. He asked if I understood what turning this over to the prosecutor would mean. I told him I understood. But then I took the journal back home with me because I couldn't make the decision right away. For 3 days, I kept the journal in my car. I'd drive to the prosecutor's office and sit in the parking lot. Then I'd drive home without going in. I kept thinking about Dante as a little kid. The son who used to help me fix the car on weekends. The teenager who made me laugh with his terrible jokes. But I also kept thinking about Ryder sitting in that jail cell for something he didn't do. About Sienna's bruised face. About Sarah and all the other women Dante had hurt. On the 4th day, I walked into the prosecutor's office and handed over the journal. The prosecutor was a woman in her 40s named Jennifer. She took the journal and started reading it right there while I sat in her office. Her face got harder as she read. After 20 minutes, she closed it and looked at me. She said this was damning evidence of premeditation and escalating violence. She said they were adding stalking charges based on the entries about following Sarah. She started making notes about subpoenaing Sarah as a witness. I felt sick knowing I'd just provided evidence that would put my son away for even longer. But I also knew it was the right thing to do. Jennifer thanked me for coming forward. She said many parents wouldn't have done what I just did. When I got home that afternoon, Ryder was sitting on the couch. He looked up when I walked in. He said Finn had called him and told him about the journal, about me turning it over to the prosecutor. I started to explain, but Ryder stood up and walked over to me. For the first time since coming home from jail, he hugged me. He wrapped his arms around me tight and held on. He said, "Thank you. Thank you for believing him. Thank you for choosing what was right over protecting Dante." I broke down crying right there in our living room. I told him I was sorry. Sorry I didn't believe him immediately when he said he was innocent. Sorry it took video evidence to convince me. Sorry he had to spend even one night in that jail. Ryder pulled back and looked at me. He said he understood why I doubted him at first. He said the evidence looked bad and he didn't blame me. But this, turning over the journal, this proved I was on his side now. We stood there for a while just holding each other. It was the first time in weeks that the house felt like it might be okay someday. 2 days later, the jail called. Dante wanted to talk to me. I accepted the call even though part of me didn't want to hear his voice. The moment the line connected, he started screaming. He called me a traitor. He said I destroyed his life by giving the prosecutor his private journal. He said I had no right to go through his personal things. I let him yell for about a minute. Then I cut him off. I told him he destroyed his own life when he beat Sienna, when he threatened her into blaming Ryder, when he let his innocent brother sit in jail for something he did. I said the journal just showed everyone who he really was. Dante went quiet for a second. Then he said, I never understood him. That I always took everyone else's side. That I was a terrible father. I told him I loved him, but I couldn't support him avoiding consequences for what he'd done. He hung up on me. I sat there holding the dead phone feeling like I'd lost a son, even though I knew he'd lost himself long before I found that journal. A week later, I got a phone call from someone named Seth Carson. He said he used to work with Dante at Westbrook Construction. He'd seen news coverage of the arrest and wanted to talk to me. We met at a coffee shop near my house. Seth was in his 30s with a nervous energy about him. He said Dante was fired from Westbrook Construction 6 months ago. I asked why. Seth looked uncomfortable. He said Dante had threatened a female coworker who rejected his advances. Her name was Amanda. Dante had asked her out multiple times and she kept saying no. One day he cornered her in the parking lot after work and told her she was making a mistake, told her she'd regret turning him down. Amanda reported it to HR and they fired him the next day. Seth said he was willing to testify about what happened, about Dante's history of aggression toward women at work. I thanked him and gave his contact information to Jennifer at the prosecutor's office. The next day, Seth called me again. He said his wife Mara wanted to talk to me too. She'd witnessed something involving Dante. I met them both at the same coffee shop. Mara was a small woman with dark hair. She worked at Westbrook Construction in accounting. She said she'd seen Dante grab Amanda's arm during an argument in the break room. She said he grabbed hard enough that Amanda had visible bruises the next day. Mara had wanted to report it, but Amanda begged her not to because she was afraid of making things worse. But now with Dante arrested for assault, Mara wanted to come forward. She said she'd testify about what she saw. I sat there listening to these two strangers tell me about my son's violence, about a whole pattern I knew nothing about. I felt devastated that I'd been so blind to who he really was. I called Jennifer and gave her Mara's information too. A few days later, Jennifer called me. She said with the journal and the coworker testimony, they had an extremely strong case. She said Dante's public defender had reached out about a plea deal. The offer was plead guilty to reduce charges and get 8 years instead of risking 15 at trial. She said the public defender wanted me to encourage Dante to take it. I told her I'd think about it. That night, Dante's public defender called me directly. She said Dante was being stubborn about the plea. He didn't want to admit guilt. She thought hearing from me might change his mind. She said 8 years was a good deal considering the evidence against him. I agreed to visit him. The next morning, I drove to the jail. They brought Dante out to the visiting area, and he sat down across from me. He looked different. Not crying like the last time. Not angry either, just cold and detached. I told him about the plea deal. 8 years if he pleaded guilty. He stared at me without any expression. Then he said he wouldn't plead guilty. I asked why not. He said because pleading guilty meant admitting he was a bad person, and he didn't think he was bad. He said Sienna deserved what happened for cheating on him with Ryder, that she needed to learn respect. I felt my chest get tight listening to him. This wasn't my son sitting across from me. This was someone I didn't recognize at all. I leaned forward and looked him in the eyes. I told him Sienna didn't belong to him, that no woman belongs to any man, that what he did was unforgivable, that beating someone and threatening them wasn't teaching them anything except fear. Dante laughed. It was a bitter sound that made my skin crawl. He said I was just like everyone else, taking their side. He said I never understood him, never tried to see things from his perspective. He said women like Sienna played games and then acted innocent when men got upset. I stood up. I told him I was done, that if he couldn't see what he'd done wrong, then there was nothing more to say. He shrugged like he didn't care. As I walked away, I realized my son had no remorse at all. He genuinely believed he was the victim in all of this. That realization hurt worse than anything else that had happened. The guard led me back through the security doors, and I walked across the parking lot in a fog. I got to my car and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. My hands were shaking so bad I couldn't get the key in the ignition. I tried 3 times before I gave up and just sat there staring at the steering wheel. Then it hit me all at once. My son was a monster. Not the angry teenager I remembered, but an actual dangerous person who hurt women and felt nothing about it. I started crying and couldn't stop. Big, ugly sobs that made my whole body shake. I cried for an hour straight sitting in that parking lot. Other people walked past my car and probably thought I was crazy, but I didn't care. I was grieving the son I thought I raised. The kid who used to build forts in the living room and collect baseball cards. That person never existed, or maybe he did once and turned into something else. Either way, he was gone, and this cold stranger who laughed about beating Sienna had taken his place. When I finally stopped crying, my eyes were so swollen I could barely see. I drove home going 10 miles under the speed limit because my vision was blurry. At home, I found Ryder sitting on the couch watching TV, not hiding in his room with the door locked like he'd been doing, just sitting there with a bowl of cereal eating breakfast at 2 in the afternoon. It was such a normal thing, but it felt huge. I sat down next to him and he didn't flinch away. We watched some cooking show together without talking. After a while, he got up and made himself a sandwich. Actually came into the kitchen and used the stove to make grilled cheese. I watched him from the doorway, trying not to cry again. These tiny, normal things felt like massive victories. Over the next few weeks, Ryder kept improving bit by bit. He started eating 3 meals a day instead of just picking at food. He'd come out of his room to watch TV in the evenings. Sometimes he'd even sit with me during dinner. Gracie called me one afternoon to talk about his progress. She said he was doing better than she expected, but I needed to understand this wasn't a straight line. He'd have good days and bad days, maybe good weeks and then suddenly a terrible week. The trauma of being falsely accused and jailed doesn't just go away. He might struggle with trust issues for years, might have anxiety around police or loud noises or being accused of anything. She said some of her clients never fully recover. They just learn to live with it. That scared me, but I appreciated her honesty. A few days later, the prosecutor called. Her name was Jennifer Westbrook, and she'd been building the case against Dante. She said they were moving forward with trial since Dante rejected the plea deal. They had a strong case with Sienna's testimony, the video evidence, the journal and statements from Seth and Mara, but they wanted Ryder to testify too. They needed him to describe the scratches Sienna gave him during their argument, needed him to talk about being falsely accused and arrested. It would show the jury the full scope of what Dante did, how he didn't just beat Sienna, but deliberately framed his own brother. I told her I'd talk to Ryder about it. That night at dinner, I brought it up as gently as I could. Ryder's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. His face went pale and his breathing got fast and shallow. He put the fork down and gripped the edge of the table. I recognized a panic attack starting. I moved closer and told him to breathe slowly. In through the nose, out through the mouth. He did it for a few minutes until his breathing evened out. Then he asked in this small voice if he had to testify. I said no. Nobody could force him, but it would help make sure Dante got convicted. He stared at his plate for a long time. Finally, he said he'd do it. He said if he could survive 3 days in jail for something he didn't do, he could survive telling the truth in court. He wanted Dante held accountable. He wanted everyone to know what really happened. Over the following week, Finn worked with Gracie to prepare Ryder for testimony. They did practice sessions at Finn's office where Finn would ask him questions like a lawyer would in court. Ryder struggled hard with it. He'd start answering and then freeze up. Or he'd get through a few questions and then have to take a break. Gracie sat with him during the sessions and helped him use breathing techniques when he got overwhelmed. Finn was patient and kept telling him he was doing great. They practiced describing the argument with Sienna, the scratches she gave him, finding out he was accused, the arrest, the jail cell. Every time Ryder had to say it out loud, he looked like he was reliving it. His hands would shake and his voice would crack. But he kept pushing through. He told Finn that testifying felt like taking back some control. Dante had taken everything from him for 3 days, made him feel helpless and scared. Getting on that stand and telling the truth felt like fighting back. 2 weeks before the trial date, Dante's public defender called me. She said Dante wanted to change his plea. He was willing to plead guilty in exchange for 10 years instead of risking 15 at trial. She explained that seeing the full witness list and all the evidence made him realize he'd lose. The journal alone was damning. Add in Sienna's testimony, the video, Seth and Mara and Ryder, and there was no way a jury would find him not guilty. 10 years was better than 15. She said the prosecutor was considering it. They'd have to run it by Sienna and her father first. But if everyone agreed, there wouldn't be a trial. She asked if I'd support the plea deal. I said I'd think about it and hung up. Then I just sat there feeling torn in half. Part of me was relieved. No trial meant Ryder wouldn't have to testify, wouldn't have to sit in a courtroom and relive his worst nightmare in front of strangers. But another part of me was devastated. My son was going to prison for a decade. He'd be 32 when he got out. I'd missed 10 years of his life. He'd missed 10 years of everything. I called Finn and told him about the plea offer. Finn said it was probably the right move. Trials are unpredictable, and this way there's certainty. Dante would definitely go to prison and Ryder wouldn't have to testify. He reminded me that Dante made his own choices. He chose to beat Sienna, chose to threaten her, chose to frame Ryder. Now he was facing the consequences he earned. Those were hard words to hear, but they were true. 3 days later, we all gathered at the courthouse for the plea hearing. Me, Finn, Sienna and her father, the prosecutor, and Dante with his public defender. Ryder stayed home because Gracie said he wasn't ready to see Dante in person. The judge called the case and asked Dante how he pleaded. Dante stood up in his orange jumpsuit and said guilty. The judge asked if anyone forced him to plead guilty, and he said no. Then came the allocution. That's where the defendant has to describe their crimes out loud in court. The judge asked Dante to explain what he did. Dante looked down at the table and started talking in this flat voice. He said on the night in question he picked up Sienna after his brother dropped her off. They got in an argument in his car about her seeing other guys. He lost his temper and hit her multiple times in the face, punched her in the eye and split her lip. When she tried to get out of the car, he grabbed her and hit her again. Then he threatened her. Told her if she said anything, he'd come back and hurt her worse. Told her to blame his brother Ryder instead. He said he knew his brother had argued with Sienna earlier that night and had scratches from when she hit him. So he told Sienna to say Ryder beat her. After that, he drove her near her house and dropped her off. Then he left town the next day because he knew the police would come looking. Hearing it in his own voice made it undeniably real. This wasn't speculation or testimony from other people. This was Dante admitting what he did. Admitting he beat a girl he claimed to care about. Admitting he framed his own brother for it. I watched him say all of it without showing any emotion. The judge accepted the plea and scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later. She said she'd hear victim impact statements at that time. Then she remanded Dante back to jail until sentencing. The bailiff led him away and he didn't look at me once. After it was over, I walked out into the hallway. Sienna's father was standing by the windows looking exhausted. We made eye contact across the hallway. Both of us looked completely drained. Our families had been destroyed by Dante's violence. His daughter was traumatized. My innocent son was traumatized. And my other son was going to prison for 10 years. We didn't say anything, just nodded at each other with this sad understanding, and then walked away in opposite directions. A week after the plea hearing, Sienna's therapist gave her permission to write Ryder a letter. Sienna's father called to ask if that was okay, and I said I'd talk to Ryder about it. Ryder said he was willing to read it. The letter came 2 days later. Ryder took it to his room and closed the door. I didn't see him for 3 hours. When he finally came out, his eyes were red, but he looked calmer somehow. He said the letter helped a little. Knowing Sienna was forced and scared, knowing she didn't want to accuse him, but was too frightened of Dante to tell the truth. It didn't erase what he went through, didn't undo the terror of being arrested or the trauma of jail, but it helped him understand she was a victim too. That she wasn't trying to hurt him, she was just trying to survive. That same evening, I asked Ryder if he wanted to write a victim impact statement for Dante's sentencing. He could tell the judge how the false accusation affected him. I said he didn't have to decide right away. He spent the next 4 days thinking about it. I'd see him sitting on the couch staring into space, clearly wrestling with the decision. Finally, on the 5th day, he told me yes, he wanted to write one. He sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and started writing. It took him 3 hours. When he was done, he had 4 pages. He wrote about the terror of being arrested for something he didn't do, about the police putting handcuffs on him while his dad watched, about sitting in that jail cell for 3 days not knowing if anyone would believe him, about the nightmares he still had where he was trapped behind bars, about the panic attacks when he heard sirens, about not being able to trust people anymore because his own brother had betrayed him in the worst possible way. He wrote about how Dante didn't just hurt Sienna, he tried to destroy Ryder's entire life to cover up what he did. He wrote that he'd never forgive Dante for that. Never. Sienna's father called me 2 days later to say Sienna had also written a victim impact statement. His voice sounded tired on the phone. He told me she was in intensive therapy 3 times a week and still having nightmares every night. The therapist said Sienna might never fully recover from what Dante did to her. Not just the physical beating, but the fear he put in her. The way he threatened to come back and finish it if she told anyone. Sienna's father said his daughter flinches when doors open too fast. She can't be alone in a room with a man anymore, even him sometimes. I listened and felt sick knowing my son caused that damage to a 17-year-old girl. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring at a blank piece of paper. I needed to write my own statement for the sentencing hearing. As Dante's father, I had the right to speak. But what could I possibly say? I picked up my pen and started writing. It took me 4 hours to get through 2 pages. I wrote about loving Dante since the day he was born, about changing his diapers and teaching him to ride a bike and being proud when he graduated high school. But I also wrote that love doesn't excuse what he did, that Sienna deserved justice and Ryder deserved justice, and Dante needed to be held accountable. I wrote that I supported the prosecution and believed my son should face real consequences for his actions. The hardest part was the last paragraph where I admitted I'd always love him despite everything, but that didn't mean I thought his sentence was unfair. I read it over 3 times and cried each time. This statement felt like giving up on Dante, but I knew it was the right thing to do. The phone rang at 9 p.m. the night before sentencing. The jail number showed on my screen. I answered and heard Dante's voice. He asked if I was coming to court tomorrow. I told him yes because he was still my son. There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Then Dante asked if I was going to speak on his behalf. I said no, that I wrote a statement supporting accountability. Dante's voice got cold. He said he understood, that I was just like everyone else, choosing Ryder over him. I told him that wasn't true, that I loved him, but couldn't support him avoiding consequences for beating Sienna and framing his brother. Dante laughed this bitter, angry laugh and said I'd regret abandoning him. Then he hung up before I could respond. I sat holding the phone feeling like I'd just lost my son, even though he was still alive. The sentencing hearing started at 10 a.m. I sat in the back row of the courtroom. Sienna and her father sat up front on the left side. Ryder sat with Finn on the right side. The bailiff brought Dante out in an orange jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him. He looked thinner than the last time I saw him. His hair was longer and messy. The judge entered and everyone stood. She was a woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled back tight. She told everyone to sit and opened the file in front of her. The prosecutor stood and said they had 3 victim impact statements to present. First was Sienna's statement. The prosecutor read it out loud. Sienna described Dante picking her up after Ryder dropped her off that night. How they drove to a parking lot and started arguing. How Dante grabbed her by the throat and started hitting her face over and over. How she begged him to stop and he just kept going. She wrote about the fear when he threatened to kill her if she told anyone it was him. About how he said to blame Ryder or he'd come back and make it worse. About the nightmare she has now where she's trapped in that car and can't escape. I watched Dante's face while the prosecutor read. He stared straight ahead, showing nothing. No emotion at all. Next was Ryder's statement. The prosecutor read about the terror of being arrested for something he didn't do. About sitting in jail for 3 days thinking his life was over. About the panic attacks he still gets when he hears sirens. About the betrayal of his own brother trying to destroy his life to cover up his own crime. About how he'd never forgive Dante for using him as a scapegoat. I looked at Dante again, still blank, like he was listening to someone read the weather report. Finally, the prosecutor read my statement. About loving Dante but supporting accountability. About believing justice needed to be served. Dante's jaw tightened when my words were read, but he didn't look at me. The judge took off her glasses and looked directly at Dante. She said she'd reviewed his file and saw a pattern of violence toward women going back years. She mentioned the co-worker he threatened. The ex-girlfriend who suddenly stopped coming around. She said his lack of remorse was deeply concerning, that he showed no emotion hearing how he destroyed multiple lives. She said using his own brother as a scapegoat was particularly cruel and showed a level of manipulation that worried her greatly. Then she sentenced him to 10 years in state prison with possibility of parole after 7 years. She added mandatory anger management classes and counseling. She told Dante he needed serious help, and she hoped he'd use his time in prison to work on himself. Dante just nodded once. The bailiff moved to take him away. I stood up and tried to walk toward Dante. I wanted to say something. Tell him I loved him. Tell him to be safe. Something. But Dante turned his head away when he saw me coming. He refused to look at me. The bailiff led him through the side door and he was gone. That was the last time I saw him before they transferred him to state prison upstate. The weeks after sentencing were strange. I focused all my energy on helping Ryder heal. Finn worked on getting Ryder's arrest record fully expunged. He filed paperwork with 3 different courts. He said it would take a few months, but eventually Ryder's record would be completely clean. Like the arrest never happened. Gracie continued seeing Ryder twice a week for therapy. She told me privately that Ryder was making slow progress. That trauma like this takes years to process. But she saw signs he was starting to cope better, starting to trust again in small ways. Ryder came to me one afternoon and said he'd been thinking about college. He said he wasn't ready to go this fall. Too many people, too much pressure. He wanted to take a gap year. Maybe do some online classes, work part-time when he felt ready. I told him I supported whatever he needed, that there was no rush. He could take all the time he needed to heal. His relief was obvious, like he'd been worried I'd push him to go anyway. Sienna's father and I started meeting for coffee every few weeks. It sounds weird, but we developed this unlikely friendship. We were the only 2 people who really understood what happened, what our families went through. We'd sit at the coffee shop and talk about our kids, about how they were doing, about how hard it was to watch them struggle. He told me Sienna was doing better some days and worse others, that healing wasn't a straight line. I told him the same about Ryder. We never talked about Dante much. That topic was too painful for both of us. But having someone who understood helped, made me feel less alone in this nightmare. 3 months after Dante's sentencing, Ryder told me he'd had his first full week without nightmares. I was making breakfast when he said it, just casual like he was commenting on the weather. But I could see in his eyes how big that was for him. He said therapy was actually helping, that Gracie had taught him some techniques for managing the panic attacks. He'd also started going to a support group for people who were falsely accused. Meeting others who understood what he went through helped him feel less isolated, less like he was the only person this ever happened to. I hugged him and told him I was proud of how hard he was working to heal. He hugged me back, and for the first time in months, it didn't feel like he was going to break. I started writing to Dante at the state prison about a month after his transfer. Short letters on lined notebook paper telling him I loved him, but that he needed to take responsibility and work on himself through the programs they offered. I mailed 1 letter every month like clockwork. He didn't write back for 4 months, and I kept sending them anyway because he was still my son. When his first letter finally arrived, I opened it at the kitchen table with shaking hands. The handwriting was messy and angry. He wrote 3 pages blaming everyone but himself. Sienna for cheating, Ryder for being the favorite, me for not understanding him. The words were defensive and bitter, and I folded the letter back up feeling sick. Meanwhile, Finn was making progress on getting Ryder's arrest record dealt with. He filed motions in 3 different courts and paid fees and submitted paperwork for weeks. 2 months after Dante's sentencing, Finn called with good news. The record was officially sealed and expunged. Background checks wouldn't show the arrest. Legally, Ryder could say he'd never been arrested. Finn said it was a small victory, but an important one for Ryder's future job prospects and college applications. I told Ryder that afternoon and watched relief wash over his face. He said it felt like one piece of the nightmare was finally erased, even though he knew he'd always remember it. Around the same time, Ryder started taking online classes through the community college. Just 2 classes to start. Introduction to Psychology and American Government. He'd sit at the kitchen table with his laptop doing assignments and reading textbooks. One day he told me he'd been looking into criminal justice reform programs. Stuff about false accusations and wrongful imprisonment. He said reading about other people's experiences helped him feel less alone. I mentioned it to Gracie during one of our check-ins, and she said it was actually really healthy. She said Ryder was channeling his trauma into something meaningful instead of letting it destroy him. 6 months after everything happened, Gracie brought up the idea of Ryder meeting with Sienna in person. Both their therapists would be present. Ryder was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. The meeting happened at Gracie's office on a Tuesday afternoon. I drove Ryder there and waited in my car in the parking lot. He was inside for over an hour. When he came out, his eyes were red from crying, but he looked lighter somehow. He got in the car and told me it gave him closure, hearing Sienna's full story directly from her. Seeing that she was working hard to heal too, understanding that they were both victims of Dante in different ways. He said they talked about the night everything happened and about the 2 months she'd been secretly seeing Dante. She told him about the threats Dante made, how scared she was, how sorry she was for what Ryder went through because of her fear. Ryder said he told her he understood why she did what she did and that he forgave her. They both cried a lot, according to him. Gracie told me later that it went as well as could be expected, that Ryder and Sienna wouldn't ever be friends again, but they'd reached a place of mutual understanding and forgiveness. They both acknowledged they were victims of Dante's violence and manipulation in different ways. That recognition seemed to matter to both of them. 8 months after Dante's sentencing, I finally worked up the courage to visit him in prison. The drive upstate took 3 hours. I had to go through security and get searched and leave my phone in a locker. They led me to a visiting room with plastic tables and chairs bolted to the floor. Dante came out in prison blues looking different, harder somehow. His face was thinner and his eyes were cold. We sat across from each other and the conversation felt stilted and uncomfortable. I asked how he was doing and he shrugged. Said prison was what you'd expect. I asked about the anger management classes the judge ordered, and he said yeah, he'd been going. He admitted he had a lot of work to do. His voice was flat when he said it. Not defensive like his letter, but not genuine either. Just going through the motions. Before I left, he told me something that surprised me. He said he'd been reading books about abuse and control from the prison library. That he was starting to understand what he did to Sienna wasn't about love, but about power. About needing to control her. It was the first time he'd shown any real insight into his actions. I didn't trust it completely because it felt rehearsed, but it was something. A crack in the wall he'd built around himself. I drove home thinking about that conversation for hours. Back home, Ryder was making his own progress. He got a part-time job at a bookstore in town, just 15 hours a week shelving books and working the register. He came home after his first week and told me about a coworker named Archer who was around his age. They'd started talking during breaks about books and movies. Archer didn't know anything about what happened to Ryder. He just treated him like a normal person without pity or awkwardness. Ryder said having someone interact with him that way helped him feel like a regular person again instead of a victim. He started going to movies with Archer on weekends, slowly rebuilding a social life outside of therapy and family. 1 year after Dante's sentencing, I looked around at our family and realized we'd found a new normal. It was complicated and imperfect, but it was something. Ryder was doing well in his online classes. He'd completed 4 courses and was talking about applying to the state university for the following fall. He wanted to study criminal justice with a focus on reform. The trauma had changed him, but he was turning it into purpose. I was proud of how hard he'd worked to heal. I kept up my monthly visits to see Dante. The drive became routine. Our relationship would never be what it was before, but I was his father, and I couldn't abandon him completely. He was making slow progress in his therapy according to the counselor I'd spoken with. He'd actually written apology letters to both Ryder and Sienna. The prison counselor helped him draft them over several weeks. Ryder showed me his letter. It was 2 pages of Dante taking responsibility and expressing remorse. Ryder said the words meant something, but they couldn't undo the damage. He'd filed the letter away in his desk drawer. I knew Sienna had received hers too through her father. Whether she read it or not wasn't my business. The apologies were a step, but only a small one in a very long journey. Sienna's father told me during one of our coffee meetings that she was doing better. She'd gone back to the school and was working with a therapist who focused on helping people recover from assault. He said she was taking it day by day but making real progress. A few months later, he mentioned she'd started seeing someone new, a guy from her college classes who treated her with respect and patience. She still had hard days where the memories hit her, but she was building a real life beyond what Dante did to her. Her father said watching her heal gave him hope after everything that happened. One night, about 18 months after the whole thing started, Ryder came into the living room while I was watching TV. He sat down next to me and was quiet for a minute before speaking. He told me he was grateful the truth came out even though the process was horrible. He said living under a false accusation would have destroyed him worse than the temporary jail time did. I listened as he explained how therapy helped him understand that what happened wasn't his fault. We sat there for a while just being together. I realized we were all moving forward in our own ways. We carried scars, but we weren't letting them define us completely. Ryder was building toward college and a future in criminal justice. Sienna was healing and finding happiness again with someone who treated her right. Dante was serving his time, and maybe starting to understand what he did. I was learning that being a father sometimes means accepting painful truths about your children while still loving them through the consequences of their choices. None of it was easy or perfect, but we were surviving, and that had to be enough.